I think what you're saying is so true. And I appreciate the conceptualization of that. There's not one of us who has bumped along in this point to this point in life that hasn't experienced some invasion or abandonment. And by that fact, by that definition, there is usually some disconnection, which is the smallest definition of trauma that I've ever heard. Trauma is disconnection, both from and within myself, and then from other people as well, because you cannot go through something without having the impact be relational. And in fact, as Dr. Gabor Mate says, it's not necessarily the trauma, it's often that we feel so alone in it.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. Today we have special guests joining us from the staff of Faithful and True. We have our host, Dr. Greg Miller. We've got Jim Farm, our clinical director, and two special guests, Kristine and Lizzy, are joining us from Onsite. Those are good friends and fellow professional organizations that are trying to help those that struggle with a variety of addictions. So Kristine and Lizzy, welcome. And I'll hand it over to Greg to take it from here, or Jim. Jim is kind of helped us set this up today.
Well, and I do just want to say thanks for being here. And our relationship, Faithful and True and Onsite, has had a relationship for a long time. And probably the best word is we are partners, that we really see the goodness and the beauty of what you do. And there's a unique contribution that y'all make that we see as with the work that we do with individuals struggling with sexual addiction and their spouses. So thanks for being here. And what we're going to be talking about in our first time together is just the trauma work. Many times working with an individual, we see that there is some pretty significant pain and trauma that they've experienced, and we know that they need some additional help, and we know that that's a great resource that y'all provide. So just tell us a little bit about kind of how you got into the trauma work, why it's become a priority, and kind of the support that you want to provide.
Well, it's interesting. So I've been with Onsite. This is Lizzy, and I've been with Onsite for 12 years. And when I first got to Onsite, a lot of our focus was on the family system and codependency. And that's kind of how it was started by our founder, Sharon White Cruz and Joe Cruz. And as we got into it, obviously trauma can be coupled with that. And it was the term trauma really started to pick up. I remember this because we were like, it almost feels like we need to create a specific trauma program that people have the space to really start to unpack that specific topic. Because family of origin, of course, can have trauma, relationships can have trauma, all of that. So those words we still worked with, but then to have a specific program where people identified and were able to address it specifically started to become a need. And so we started our healing trauma program shortly after I came to Onsite. Yeah.
One of the things the language that we use here is we talk about the fact that everybody has experienced invasion and abandonment. Everybody experienced it in the home and out of the home. And if you're using kind of a continuum of 1 to 10, there are those individuals that their invasion, their abandonment is more in that 7, 8, 9, 10 range. And so there is a greater influence or outcome it has on their lives. So what might be some indicators that someone does have some pretty significant pain and are still living in the chaos of early trauma, and maybe they're not even aware of it?
Kristine, you want to answer that?
Sure. Yeah, this is Kristine, and such an honor to be here. I think what you're saying is so true, and I appreciate the conceptualization of that. There's not one of us who has bumped along in this point to this point in life that hasn't experienced some invasion or abandonment. And by that fact, by that definition, there is usually some disconnection, which is the smallest definition of trauma that I've ever heard. Trauma is disconnection, both from and within myself, and then from other people as well, because you cannot go through something without having the impact be relational. And in fact, as Dr. Gabor Mate says, it's not necessarily the trauma, it's often that we feel so alone in it, that it is the fact that we've been through something, and then it's left most of us feeling like, I'm the worst, I'm the only, I'm the smallest, I'm the biggest, all of the scripts that come up from the unresolved trauma that then begin to form how I am in the world, which then becomes its own pervasive cycle of, if I go into the world small and then get not seen, that will again dig into my own conceptualization of I'm small, I'm invisible, I'm not worthy. So I think to more further answer your question, the people who are on the 7 end of the scale, or people who have the unresolved trauma that they may not even know that they're carrying around, are people who have symptoms and are trying to treat that. So for me, symptoms is anything from irritability, restlessness, lack of sleep, depression, anxiety, those things that we are over medicated but under looking at in some ways, or not looking under. And I would argue that if you look under those things, then chances are there's trauma. And when you can pull out that and address it at the root, then all of the sudden, I don't need to have a life of battling the symptoms.
And one thing I would say is that the first thing that you identified is the role that shame plays and the messages of shame that we carry. And from our perspective, we talk about shame are the lies that we believe about ourselves and the lies that we believe about God. So it makes perfect sense, if there's significant invasion and abandonment, that it's going to distort my perception of reality and truth, and whatever it is that I'm experiencing becomes my truth, and it keeps me from living in the truth that God intended. And so even to recognize where there's shame, it may be important for me to begin to ask, where did I begin to learn those lies of shame, and what were the actual experiences that taught me those lies?
Absolutely, because we will, as a human race, make it make sense. And for so many of us, the traumas that happen so young, often even pre-verbal, I can't make sense of through a language. So I will make sense of as through me. It must have been my fault that dad was angry. It must have been my fault that, fill in the blank, that, mom seemed to get sick. Whatever it is, we will make sense of it to make sense of it. And through that self-identity attachment to making sense of it, we take on that trauma and we take that on as ourselves.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Kristine. One of the things I often would hear, especially at the workshops that we hold, is kind of what I describe as this hidden trauma. It's more of this trauma of neglect. We might hear a guy say, "Well, I didn't get abused. I didn't get hit. I didn't have any sexual abuse." But then when you dive deeper, it's more kind of this neglect. How do you guys help with that when you hear those types of things?
I think some of the ways that we deal with it is there needs to be a compassionate lens towards self that isn't often available in the sense of shame. So for instance, if someone were, I had it pretty good, right? Yes, and then to go back into that, and that's why we use experiential as a modality, because at that point of not being seen, heard, or accepted, the 3 basic innate rights and the things that we need as human beings, to be seen, to be appreciated, to be known, those kind of things at that core level, if that's not happening, and if that's not happening again and again with chronicity, or by the people that ideally are there to be able to support us, then that is an embedded trauma, and it will not be seen as, we were talking about the symptoms, it will probably show up as symptoms. And then to walk a client back, if I look back and say, yeah, you know what, I didn't have the newest Nintendo game, and I know I'm aging myself, but all the rest seemed great. Yeah, that's true. And then if I walk myself all the way back into the eyes of a 4-year-old who got lost at the grocery aisle and felt all alone and felt like no one was going to come get her, then somewhere at a cellular level, that experience is coded and stored as trauma. And without making meaning of it, I will make me it. And I didn't let you speak on that, Lizzy, so feel free to jump in.
Yeah.
One thing that we see is there is a nature in minimizing that makes surviving possible. You know, as children, a lot of times we will tell ourselves it's not that bad, because if it's not that bad, then it may be survivable. And so one of the truth is that ability to minimize is essential early on, but eventually begins to become destructive because I'm not able to right size the experience that I've had. And, you know, we talk about experience. We don't want to minimize it and tell ourselves it wasn't that big of a deal, but we don't want to catastrophize it. That's kind of the other end of the pendulum where there's no hope in it. But what is truly freeing is when we're able to right size it, and whatever is true. And then from that place, be able to move forward.
Oh, I love that. And you're speaking to my language in terms of the coping. Truly, anything that we do makes sense in the context of why we did it. Mm-hmm. And so I know the language recently in the trauma field has changed from what's wrong with you, pathologizing the person, into what happened to you. Mm-hmm. And if I can borrow that perspective, as you're saying, to right size it, to me makes me, the invitation is there to see it not only as the adult that survived it as I am now, but as the little person within, that part of self that got abandoned and didn't know how to cope with it other than to say, I guess it's not that bad. No one around me is freaking out. I don't know. So right. I appreciate that both the perspective of the adult that survived and the part of me that was going through it at the time need to have a joint scene in order to have the feeling that leads to the healing to release me from those frozen and traumatic moments.
Yeah. You know, one of the images that I use is if you live in Florida, you need to build a house that can withstand a hurricane. And if you build a house that withstands a hurricane 2, that's great until the category 3 comes. And emotionally, we have to build an infrastructure that can survive some of the worst storms. And so what's true is sometimes we need an infrastructure to survive an acknowledgement of the pain and the trauma. How do you assess when someone really is at a space and a place in their life where they can move towards truth that is incredibly difficult and painful? And then how do you determine when someone's not quite ready yet to engage that truth?
Lizzy, go ahead, because you're on the admission side. I know you got this one.
I know. Well, yeah, it's interesting. I was just, the shame piece. I see that so much with people when they call and just have a hard time. Well, no, nothing happened to me, but I can't, but my relationship's falling apart and this and that. So there's like a willingness there, but there's still that guarded of the past. And so with the different things that we do, we just try. I feel like when we talk with people, we just try to find the window. It doesn't have to be a big one. If there's just a little gap of willingness of like, well, I know like I mentioned, my relationship's struggling. So I want to look at that. And it's like, okay, let's go with that, because maybe that'll be the door that opens to unpacking what happened or what really you're hiding or what really you're shameful of, to move into handling the trauma. So we rarely, unless someone is just completely like not on board, we're gonna find that little gap to help get to them and put every resource and tool and amazing clinician like Kristine around it to help them start to slowly peel back the layers and move at that pace. And then
I appreciate that. Yeah, and there's a pendulation. So when someone has that opening, that window of willingness, that ability to say, I don't know what to do, but what I'm doing maybe is not working the way I'd like it in my life, then we can link arms with them and walk through some resourcing from the point that they come into the program. And I used to tell clients, I'm not magical. I can't push you past where you're willing to go. At least I wouldn't ethically. And if I'm in this with you, I will not abandon you again by going too far ahead of you. And And so there is this point where I think there's a real reading of the person, and there's so much at Onsite that I believe is the biggest nature of healing, which means it's not all the deep dive depth work. We come up for air, we exhale, we go into the nature, we resource by having play and games and incredible food. So I think because trauma is a full-bodied mind, body, spirit trauma, then so does the healing have to take place in that way. And I guess what I would offer is that we will go with you, not ahead of you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe what I'm hearing is the person's resistance is the indicator of their readiness. And so they may not consciously be aware of why they are resistant, but that resistance is the unconscious or subconscious saying, we're not quite ready to go there yet. And we talk with the men and the women that come to Faithful and True that yet is the most hopeful term, because yet lets whatever is true now be true, and yet also cast the possibility that where I am now, I won't always be. And so maybe I'm just not ready yet, and I can be open to the possibility that down the road I will be.
I love that. And we have a phrase in our modality of experiential that there is no such thing as resistance. There's only lack of warm up. So yeah, absolutely. I honor that. What you did to survive and the coping mechanisms, and including the quote unquote resistance, is what you did to survive at this point. I'm not going to rip that away from you until that yet becomes the invitation that there may be something different just beyond the corner. And until you begin to hang on that hope with me, we're going to go there together.
One other thing that I think is significant is when the trauma comes from within the family, that there is a sense of loyalty, and that loyalty needs to be honored. That I can live in the truth of what I experience in the context of my family, and I can be loyal because they are my family. And sometimes we don't feel like truth and loyalty can live in the same space. But the reality is, if there's not that loyalty piece, there can't fully be the truth either. And so, whatever that looks like, for someone to remain loyal to their history, their heritage, their story, their family, their relationships, to find ways to honor that so that there can be loyalty and there can also be truth.
That resonates so much for me, not to share too much personally, but that. So my family of origin, I was thinking, I always thought my father lived on a pedestal. He was perfect. He did no harm. He was wonderful. And my work really started when I started seeing him as an imperfect being that did the best he could. I still think he's a wonderful father, but until I was able to see yes, he was perfect. And did I get all the nurturing, or did I get everything I needed? Not really, because he was imperfect and his parents were imperfect. That I was really able to make huge strides in my recovery journey, and so that I love hearing that truth, loyalty, because it was hard to be no, to even admit any kind of wrong for him,
Yeah, Lizzy, I heard you say that, and that we don't have to live in this black and white, that it's either or, but it's that and piece that I heard out of your own story, and that is powerful. It's one of the things we often teach at Faithful and True.
Yeah, the ampersand.
That's right.
Well, and one of our principles is all truth creates freedom. Even painful truth still creates freedom. And that loyalty piece, that honoring piece, is to be willing to live in the truth and let the truth be what is honoring. And that is very different. I mean, we work with a Christian community that many of them have been taught that to honor your mother and father is also to not live in truth, to keep family secrets, to maintain the family image, to retell the old family stories. And so one of the things that we have to encourage people to understand, that the most honoring thing that you can do for your family is to be a truth teller. And again, that truth is honoring, even if it is painful, and it does disorient us because it doesn't align with our beliefs about our family, or the image of our family, or even the stories that we have been told or tell about our families. And so that deconstruction piece can be difficult, and many times deconstruction is what leads to freedom.
Absolutely. I am reminded of John Bradshaw's work. So if we all grew up with a version of don't trust, don't talk, don't feel, and that's what I've become loyal to, then I don't know if that's the same thing as being loyal to my mother, honor thy father, my mother.
Mhm.
It's not. It's am I loyal to the legacy of lies that have kept this family bound, or am I for freedom? Am I for the ultimate healing? And I appreciate those groundbreakers like Lizzy, who are at the forefront of their family doing it just a bit differently, which not only frees Lizzy, not only the person, but also frees her past and unchains that part, but also changes the trajectory of her future. Her kids will have been better. And I heard a phrase once that it's hard to feel like an adult until you're ready to be angry at your parents. So there is a step towards becoming fully realized as a human being that we have to go through, and take all those people off the pedestals to love them as the humans they are. In the Christian tradition, that is the highest form of love, loving someone for who they are.
One distinction I would love to hear about is this idea, the distinction between circumstantial trauma and like an environmental trauma. And so the circumstantial trauma is I had this experience that was specific, that was traumatizing, versus I was in this environment, an ongoing environment that also was traumatizing. How do you help people understand that and navigate the complexity of both of those things?
Sure. Do you want me to take that one, Lizzy?
Yeah.
I'm from Idaho originally, so I'm going to tell you a little story. Idaho people got some stories, and I think it relates that when I was a teenager, one of our most fun things to do was get on the back of a big old truck, and we would go truck surfing, which sounds horrible, but a dirt road with a ski rope and bouncing around. So if I were to, the rest of the story is hypothetical. I turned out okay, I think. But if I were to fall out of that truck, but hang on to that ski rope, bouncing across a dusty county road at like 13 miles an hour, I might get bruised, and they might eventually see that I'm not in the back of the truck. So a mile down the road at 13 miles per hour, I will have some scrapes, but it won't be lethal. But I will be pretty dinged up. If I were going on that same truck and I was in the cab this time trying to be a responsible teenager, if there is such a thing, and someone sideswiped the car at twice the speed, 26 miles per hour, I would still get dinged up. If you took me to the hospital from either of those incidents, I would have lacerations, I would have bruises, cuts, and they would check to see if my ribs were broken. So either way, whether I'm bouncing along a dirt road with hanging on for dear life at a slow pace, it is going to be painful and cause injuries. If I get that one smack side swipe of a car, it is going to be painful and there's going to be injuries. And I truly believe that we have done ourselves a disservice. It goes back to that minimization you were talking about looking at the cause to assess the impact. And truly, I think trauma-informed care is to say there's an impact, and what that meant to you. I don't know how many of you all were like me, grew up with some siblings, but I can have a radically different experience of my childhood than either of my siblings, and same set of parents, roughly the same time period. So it is our subjective creating meaning on top of the reality that then begins to create our reality and what the meaning we're beginning to make of ourselves.
Well, and I would even say, because we hear that all the time about we all grew up in the same family, but we have different interpretations or perceptions. But what's true is it's an intersection of who I was individually, the intersection with the experience, and it was also the intersection of my age at the time. So a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 14-year-old moving through a parent's divorce are going to have very different experiences because they're different ages, but they're also different people. And so, you know, it is fascinating when you get siblings together and they start talking about it, and it does seem as if they were in two different homes. But the reality is that personal intersection in age is a significant part of how they internalize whatever it is that they're going through.
Yes, and that chronological age is also an indicator of my relational ability. Both the relationship I'm having with myself is different at 4, 10, and also the relationship I'm having with the world. When I started having trauma at a very young age, it was way before cell phones, but even if they had been around at 5 years old, I'm not going to be able to pick up a cell phone and check it out with my peers and say, so what's going on in your household? Because I don't know. Feels a little funky. Or, hey mom, I'm looking at Psychology Today profiles. I feel like it's ready. I'm ready. I need some help. We have less resources, less of an ability to connect at different ages. And that is often the time, according to the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that a lot of us have one of our first and most formative traumas before the age of 10. So, and most of us have 4 or more, which severely impacts the rest of our lives, including our health.
Absolutely. Well, as we kind of come to an end in this particular podcast, tell us a little bit about Onsite and kind of the resources that are available specifically around someone who may be listening that is aware that they might need some help specifically with trauma, or if we're going to be directing somebody there, what is it that they can expect?
Yeah, so we do a broad range of things. We can do from a 4-day individual one-on-one experience to a week-long group process to a 30-day inpatient intensive, all focused on trauma or a number of issues like relationship issues, codependency, different things that we do focused on the individual, the couple, or the family. And so just depending on, it's interesting because anybody with a heartbeat can benefit from our program. So you don't have to have an ism, you don't have to have a specific life-altering crisis to come and improve your life and start to look back, unpack what's happened so you can show it better in your relationships. If that's your story though, and you do have an ism or you do have something, then great, we can do that too. But I just like people to know that it doesn't have to be a big crisis for you to come and take a week, get fed really well, get loved on, get cared for, get away from your phone, and just let us do what we do best, which is, experiential group processing and giving you a chance to be a better version of yourself.
Mm-hmm. In conclusion, Jim, I know that you've had some professional development at Onsite. So what would you want our listeners to know about what they can expect and what your experience was?
At Onsite? Well, mm-hmm. When I went down there for the training, it was fascinating because, most of the trainings in my field, you go and you sit and you listen to someone lecture,
mm-hmm.
And immediately when you get there at Onsite for the training, it's an experiential thing. And I'm like, wait a moment, this is not the way it's supposed to go, and you find out real quickly, this is just not about training, but it's about your own personal growth. And what these gals are saying is exactly right. You get fed well. I don't know if Linda's still there. She was the best, when I was down there. But you get fed well, great accommodations, and just really, really great work. They kind of pinpoint things and help you to, really identify those areas of growth. And the professional training was really good because they do a great job, you guys, in terms of, just being able to teach you the experiential model, which I know we're going to talk about here next, Greg.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great transition and segue, because in our next podcast, we're going to talk about what experiential work is, because for a lot of our listeners, that may not be something that they're that they're familiar with. And so we'll talk more about what it is to go through an experiential therapy.
We've never had so much trouble trying to end a podcast ever. You guys are far too interesting, far too personable for us to pull the plug on this. But Kristine and Lizzy, thank you so much for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. And we will look forward to having you back very soon to continue this conversation. To our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We invite you to go to our Faithful and True YouTube channel and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Click the like button. We appreciate that greatly. And we hope that this coming week for you is going to be a week that's filled with many blessings and great vision.